Let's now continue with reactions to the President's announcement. Mkhuleko Hlengwa from the IFP joins us now from the line. Mr. Hlengwa, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Good evening. Thank you, and good evening to the viewers.
Could this be perhaps a confirmation of most South Africans' fears that the lockdown could be extended indefinitely now that the President didn't give any timelines?
Well, it only follows that he doesn't give a timeline because we are chasing a moving target. It could be that on the 1st of May we move to stage 4, only to find that 5 days later we may have to move back to stage 5, depending on the rate of the transmissions and infections and the deaths. So it's important, however, that there is a structure put in place for the purposes of managing the lockdown and the leveling of it, just like load shedding, to know exactly where we are is important. Secondly, it's important that this be transcended to provinces as well, because the scenarios may be very, very different for the purposes of movement, given the caveat the President gave that there will be no movement between provinces. So we cannot at this point in time, anybody really for certainty say when the lockdown will end. And it's precisely for this reason that the IFP actually welcomes the interventions and the announcements that the President has made tonight, because they provide a level of assessment for everybody to see really in terms of how we are moving. And it's why we continue to call for South Africans to adhere to the regulations regardless of the movement of the levels, because the risks and the threats remain the same.
The fact that a slight amendment has been made on the lockdown regulations and the economy, the President mentioned, will be reinvigorated in the sense that businesses will resume, but in a phased manner. Do you think it'll have a bit of a difference on the country's economy?
Well, it's going to be it's a practical move because it provides for some activity within the economy, and it's important that the measures that the President announced a few days ago are coupled with practical, activity on the ground of the economy. But what is also important is the opening up of the space for consultations and submissions with the relevant industries, because throughout this period of the lockdown and after the declaration of the disaster, the regulations have been very unilateral, with very little due regard for consultation, particularly amongst the affected sectors and so on. And so we believe that that kind of engagement will put business and government on the same page to share experiences so that we can stimulate the economy. But we can't just rely on the stimulus package. The stimulus package must be coupled with economic activity, but also having due regard for the risks, and therefore making sure that whatever economic activity is being set into motion on the ground is actually safe and is not going to take us back in terms of what we want to achieve as a country. So that on its own assists, particularly because we went into this disaster already in a recession, and we are also grappling with the ratings downgrades. So there does need to be a pragmatic push towards economic activity.
When Finance Minister Tito Mboweni delivered his budget speech in February, he had absolutely no clue at all of what would be hitting the country the way it's been hit by the coronavirus. So as a parliamentarian yourself, Mr. Hlengwa, what would you suggest the country does? I mean, some economists have been calling for the parliament to convene an emergency budget, and some others have been, of the view that the finance minister Tito Mboweni should also amend his October's midterm budget policy statement. What's your view?
Well, the nature of economics requires you to be agile, and so the minister must exercise economic agility and be able to respond in real time to the challenges that prevail, and that is why we welcome interventions of the Reserve Bank, for example, so that we do not confine ourselves to the rigid timelines which may be, dictated by the Money Bill Acts and so on. But having said that, obviously the budget that Parliament passed when it closed ahead of the lockdown will need to be changed, because the spending of government departments was not envisaged to respond to Corona, and so the the issues of deviations and diversions which are provided for in the PFMA and the National Treasury regulations will of course come into effect, but there needs to be a far more structured way to do that. And I think the fact that Parliament is setting up its own capabilities and capacities for virtual meetings is going to assist the process, and the committees which are in the front line of oversight insofar as this pandemic is concerned are already meeting, and Finance and SCOPA, amongst others, will be having joint meetings for the purposes of ensuring that there is adherence to the law, and that the budget itself is responsive to the crisis, but also at the same time not losing sight of the other broader competing priorities which confront South Africa. So there does need to be a fair balance between the two, and by the time the minister presents the medium-term budget policy statement in October, some of the issues will be done retrospectively insofar as approvals of Parliament is concerned, but nothing prevents government at this point in time from exercising the agility I speak about, particularly within the parameters of the PFMA and the MFMA, because the municipalities themselves are at the coalface of the services which need to be provided to South Africans, the issues of water and so on. And so it's important that the deviations and diversions and expansions and deviaments are all done, and that Parliament exercises oversight over ensuring that whatever is done within the law.
Well, whatever the committees decide on this matter, it should be understood, Mr. Hlengwa, that Mr. Tito Mboweni is not a fan of emergency budget. Instead, he told us that he has taken that ideological position of approaching the World Bank and the IMF. And now that these two international lenders decided, to offer some sort of reprieve or relief to South Africa with no stringent conditions, would you also support that move?
Well, I mean, we can only take at face value and in principle what the minister is saying, that until we have scrutinized the documentation and the terms and conditions and satisfy ourselves that they achieve what is, in the national interest for South Africans. But of course, our options were very limited because we were already dealing with a strained budget. We are already dealing with a strained economic activity in the country, and the fact that, as I was saying, there's the recession and also the downgrade. So the space to maneuver is very, very limited, and so we have to cast the net as wide as possible insofar as sourcing funds is concerned. But what must not be at play here is ideological rigidity, because this pandemic is not rigid in itself. We need to be able to respond in real time to its maneuvers and to its realities and to the consequences which will come out of it, which will really have no ideological bearing but a human bearing, and of course the ripple effects of that will be economical. So the minister must be able to be imaginative and innovative himself insofar as how the restructuring of the budget will be done, and to ensure that there is space enough to ensure that we don't compromise on the developmental agenda of the country as well, because people still need water, they still need access to healthcare outside the pandemic. It doesn't mean that everything has stopped, and so he needs to find a fair balance between the two, and an ideological approach is not going to help him in that regard.
And on the flip side of the coin, why doesn't the country look inward and consider all sources of domestic finance, for instance? And why doesn't the Reserve Bank, for instance, collaborate with the local domestic and finance institutions?
Well, those collaborations must take place themselves, but the question that we need to ask is that will they go far enough to actually ensure that we achieve the intended objectives? This needs to be a multi-pronged approach, really. It needs domestic effort, it needs regional cooperation, particularly in SADC and in the EU, because there will be consequences for South Africa arising out of the continent should things take a turn for the West. And of course, the fact that the US is not wanting to fund the World Health Organization because of the petty politics that's playing itself out on that end of the world. So all those factors combined mean that South Africa cannot be linear in its approach, and there is need for collaboration across all the sectors, and I'm sure that the domestic finance institutions themselves recognize the national responsibility that rests on their shoulders on one hand, but also their corporate social responsibility on the other, to make sure that assistance is given, particularly to vulnerable communities and vulnerable individuals. So all these things must be put into the basket, and we must weigh up all of them, their pros and cons, and take out the best combination which will arise out of all those issues. So a lot of work does need to still take place at that level to ensure that there is a structure and focus insofar as how we deal with the issues of funding.
Mkhuleko Hlengwa, Inkatha Freedom Party member and parliamentary chairperson of the subcommittee on public accounts, joining us on the line. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you.